Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Political Studies Association Conservatism Studies Group Conference, Johnsonism, Conservatism in the Age of Johnsonism. We've got a wonderful packed room here with people, and we've got a lot of you on Zoom as well. So this is hopefully going to shape up to be a really interesting event. I will be monitoring Zoom for questions. So if you do have anything to say, please feel free. We are, in most conference traditions, already running behind, so I will keep my words short. But the University of Liverpool is delighted to host this conference. Conservatism Studies Group is delighted to organise it. We'd like to thank the PSA, without whose support we wouldn't be able to do this. And before we begin, I just like to do a quick plug for a Thatcher Network conference titled Thatcher's Ministers, which will be held at UCL on the 23rd and the 24th of June. Nobody said otherwise. So watch out for our Twitter feed for more information about that. But now I'll hand over to Antony, who will be chairing the first panel. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Our first panel, Johnsonism, and Policy, has three, I'm sure, excellent papers on it. The first is from Stuart McAnulla at the University of Leeds, then Georgina, Waylen, University of Manchester, then Farr at Newcastle University. Each of our speakers will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, then we'll take questions virtually and in the room at the end. So I'll hand it first of all to Stuart.
Thanks very much. If you'd like to be,
Do you mind doing that?
on there? Yeah, sure. Okay. No problem. Yeah, so nice to be here, particularly face to face. It's the first time I've done a conference in quite a while, but hello to everyone on Zoom as well. So as we know, I mean, the Johnson period has been very much dominated by crisis management, most obviously the pandemic, Ukraine, and now, of course, cost of living. But the idea from this paper came from trying to sort of step back from that and sort of bracket that crisis management out and think about what might be otherwise new or distinctive about the Johnson period. And it seemed to me that one connecting theme was issues around expression. So political expression, not just in terms of how leading figures in government express themselves, but also the politics expression more generally, issues of free speech and so on, which has implications for example, regulation of universities, online digital content, and so on. And I think that theme might help us to think about what are significant aspects of Johnsonism, if indeed there is such a thing. A quick comment on isms generally. I mean, isms generally tend to get summarized in terms of dual characteristics. So with Blairism, the third wave, it was summarized as
Sorry, these people have an audio.
Is that better for audio? Someone in the chat, is that better? Yeah. Okay. Right. Sorry. Okay. Right. So we've got audio, but no camera. So pretend it's your favorite podcast.
Okay, so yeah, isms tend to be summarized in terms of dual characteristics. So Blairism, the third wave, is summarized in terms of a dynamic economy and social justice. Thatcherism in terms of the free economy and stuff today. So in that vein, I would summarize Johnsonism, at least in these aspects, as perhaps a combination of free speech and a protective state. And I'll try and justify that interpretation by looking first at some issues around leadership, leadership expression, and then turn to some issues around speech. So as you know, Boris Johnson has a distinctive style of expression, reference often is made to his sense of humour, his wit, a willingness to kind of fly out traditional conventions of conversation.
Sorry, last time. I'm just gonna think, what we do this way. Okay, so before I do this, there we go. So for the next 15 minutes, you get to be David Jeffrey. Okay. Let's see.
Yeah, so where was it? Yeah, so we talked about Boris Johnson's sense of humour and so on. When you see how he's described, he's quite often people make reference to a clownish style. He's compared to a clown. And this made me think of there's a leader that one of the leaders that Johnson's often compared to, former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. I think someone's doing a paper on that later today. But I can't remember who it was made the quip about Berlusconi. They said he walks like a clown, he talks like a clown, but don't let that fool you. He really is a clown. And that, I think, in some ways helps us think about Johnson, in the sense that there is that sense in which he has a very kind of honed, rehearsed style. So he's developed over the years, ability to distract and so on. But at the same time, there's also a sense in which the sort of lack of discipline, sometimes in what he says, disorganization, is a sort of authentic part of his past personality. And as we've been part of his appeal, of course, but of course more recently with Partygate, we see the downside of that. We're used to talking, of course, about celebrity politicians. That's been there for a while. It was often said one of the reasons that leaders like Blair and Cameron were successful was that they had that more personable aspect to them. Call me Tony, call me Dave. And of course, we've always called Boris, Boris. So he's got that personal aspect, but he's maybe got less of those traditional statesman-like qualities that those other leaders carried. But it's an interesting question about why that might be and why it might, to a point, have been successful. Interesting suggestions by Candida Yates in an article in relation to this, where she suggests that one of the changes that's going on culturally is there's partly because of social media, there's a kind of decline in traditional paternal types of identification. So identifying with a paternal figure, that kind of relation is in decline, and people are getting more accustomed to fraternal types of relation. So in that sense, Johnson may appeal more as a kind of entertaining brother figure rather than a paternal figure. And of course, an entertaining brother, a sibling, is not someone we expect to have those personal qualities of statesmanship and so on that we expect from traditional leaders. And of course, we could extend out from Johnson to mention some of the people that have also been significant figures in the government. Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nadine Dorris, whose profile got raised very significantly by a mix of celebrity and controversy. Of course, it was Dorris who, after Boris Johnson made the Burqa gaffe, she actually defended him and said, you know, he hadn't actually gone further on the issue. So there's that aspect. It's not just about Johnson. Another feature, I think, of political expression is the way in which examples of how internet language, or the language of right-wing orientated online communities, is seeping into mainstream political discourse. This is something that Alan Finlayson emphasised at the recent PSA conference. So you see examples of ministers referencing, you know, woke psychodrama, cultural Marxism, Liz Truss even talking about postmodernism and Foucault. And I think what the connecting elements of a lot of these types of expression are issues around freedom of speech. So the underlying concern is that the left, the modern left, wants to suppress opinions. The woke people, the cultural Marxists, they don't want us to talk about history in a traditional way. They don't want us to talk about patriotism and so on. And that's, you know, one of the reasons why I think free speech is so prominent. We also know that conservatives for quite a long time have been concerned that from their perspective, universities, parts of the public sector, parts of the media are areas where conservative viewpoints or non-liberal or non-liberal left viewpoints are marginalized or sometimes treated as being kind of beyond the pale. So there's a long-standing agenda there, but the online influence is sometimes giving it a bit of a more conspiratorial edge to some of the rhetoric. Also, in terms of the purpose free speech serves, it's a good rallying point for conservatives, ideologically speaking. It doesn't matter which part of the Conservative Party you're from. If you're a liberal conservative, you want to uphold the liberal value of free speech. If you're a traditional conservative, you want to uphold it because it's an ancient British liberty, and so on. And it's not just an appeal to the conservatives. Just about everyone claims they're for free speech. There's an electoral appeal to it as well. And of course, it's an issue which it's not just about opposing the left, which they think is posing a threat to free speech through agendas on diversity, inclusion, and so on. But it's an issue which splits the left to some extent as well. So there are multiple benefits for it. But in terms of policy approaches, what do we see? I think there are three main features. First of all, what's interesting is that there's a push not just to protect free speech, but to actively promote it and to use the state to promote it. And I think this is interesting because in the history of the Conservative Party, quite often free expression is seen as a liberty which is a product of Britain's evolving political system, not something that needs to be codified. And of course, Conservatives tend to be skeptical about the Human Rights Act, which does codify freedom of expression. So we've moved from that, and now free speech is a value to be actively pushed in particular contexts. So if we take at the universities close to home, there's increasingly a sense of ministerial crusading on the issue. So in the new higher education bill, for example, proposals include creating a new director of the Office for Students with responsibility for promoting free speech and academic freedom, a new duty, or what is claimed to be a new duty on universities to not just protect free speech, but to promote it. Now, in fact, actually, that has been a duty technically, at least on universities since the 1988 Education Act. But the concern of people like Michelle Donnellan is that the practice in relation to that is very different. So recently, Michelle Donnellan complained about academics increasingly self-censoring, concerns about no platforming, academics being hounded out of jobs. So she's calling for a major cultural change. I haven't got time to go into the objections to that kind of view, but I'm sure people might have some thoughts on it. A second feature of policy is, I think, the idea of free speech that's being employed relies heavily, it conceives of free speech as about viewpoint exchange, okay, the exchange of opinion. There's not really so much about free speech, for example, as a way of holding the powerful to account. Free speech is enabling whistleblowing in institutions and so on. One of the overriding concerns that there should be what they'd see as a fair space for conservative, traditionalist, or non-liberal left viewpoints to get a hearing. And of course, many people think that the reason for recent changes announced to broadcasting, privatisation of Channel 4, scrapping the licence fee is because they think BBC and Channel 4 have been too left liberal in their presentation of political issues. Thirdly, in terms of policy, I think it's fair to say there's a lot of skepticism about how deep the commitment to free expression actually goes. And that's because there are a lot of protective impulses in the measures being considered in this area as well. So if we take the online safety bill, although Nadine Dorris has assured people that this will actually promote and protect free speech online, a lot of the emphasis, the main emphasis of the bill, of course, is to prevent harm. So to prevent harm to online users, to children who are going online and so on. And in fact, in terms of what the proposed legislation, the big platforms will have responsibility to actually remove content which might be legal but potentially harmful. So legal but harmful, they're defining this as content which could cause either psychological or physical harm to users. Now, the concern of a lot of people, including some conservative backbenchers, is that far from actually reining in big platforms, this will actually further empower them in their censorship of content, or that it will actually make platforms overcautious. So they'll over remove, they'll over censor, if you like, because they don't want to be in breach of the law. Furthermore, ministers will actually be empowered to come up with a list of potential content that should be removed. So a lot of concern about the state taking on too much power. So what you have really is the government attempting to bring some order to what is often seen as the wild west of online communication. But there are a lot of fears that this could all too easily produce in practice a massive reverse for free expression in practice. It's obviously not an issue that's getting much attention just now. There are huge issues about the cost of living crisis and so on, but the implications could be long lasting. And so this sort of balance between the impulses for free speech and these more protective impulses, I think, are going to shape the politics of expression in the next few years. So I'll leave that there. Thanks. Thanks for listening.
What? So
Can somebody over Zoom tell me if this microphone is working, please? Yes. Oh. I suppose. I mean, if people would like to hear about Johnsonism rather than my numerous tech failings, then sure. You've got your presentation, haven't you? That's fine.
Great, thank you. Right, well, it's great to be here, and what I'm doing today is outlining a new research project, Democratic Backsliding, Right-Wing Populism, the UK in Comparative Perspective, which is a slightly bigger project than this and starts properly in the autumn. And what I'm doing is using a comparative politics framing to ask how far Boris Johnson, how far we can see him as a hyper-masculine right-wing populist leader presiding over democratic backsliding. So what I'm aiming to do is put Johnson's Conservative Party into a bigger set of comparative politics debates around right-wing populism and democratic backsliding. And as you might have gathered, I'm not a British politics person or a party politics person. I'm much more of a comparative politics scholar who's worked on issues around authoritarianism and democratization, primarily in Latin America, and particularly on the gender dimensions. So I imagine I'm coming from quite a different angle to many of you. And at the moment, apart from some work on responses to the COVID pandemic that use Johnson as a case study of hypermasculine leadership, this is very preliminary work. And so I'm here really to get your feedback, your thoughts and suggestions as kind of experts in the field. How do I get it to move on? Oh, yes, okay. So the research aims really to contribute to several bodies of literature. First, to put the UK Conservative Party and the government within the wider debates about de-democratisation and backsliding, literatures that have really exploded recently, and particularly after the election of Trump. So a lot of American political scientists are very exercised by these questions. And they've been looking at why backsliding is happening and what can be done to stop and prevent it. So really a new focus on democratic resilience. So there's a special issue of the journal Democratisation last year on democratic resilience. So I'm trying to entrench the UK very firmly within those debates in comparative politics. Secondly, I'm trying to build on the sort of existing analyses of scholars like Sarah Childs and Rosie Campbell, and add sort of some new insights about how the contemporary Conservative Party is gendered, raced and classed. And finally, I want to add a sort of missing gendered kind of intersectional dimension to the largely gender blind so far literatures on both backsliding and right-wing populism, as well as providing a potentially important new case study, the UK, to the burgeoning sort of gendered and intersectional scholarship on right-wing populism that so far has focused primarily on East Central Europe. So my starting point then is the literatures on backsliding and right-wing populism. And in contrast, when we think about backsliding, so in contrast to the kind of optimism about the future of democracy that characterized the so-called third wave of democratization in the 80s and 90s, de-democratization, democratic backsliding are now seen as a growing threat to many democracies, including long-standing and seemingly consolidated ones like the US. So I'm thinking here of the work of Nancy Bermeo, Levitsky and Ziblack, Haggard and Kaufman, all those democratization scholars are now focusing much more on liberal democracies. And Haggard and Kaufman argue that backsliding, if you want to see what backsliding is or how to tell it's happening, it's evidenced by the collapse in the separation of powers, an erosion of political rights and civil liberties, and an undermining of the integrity of electoral processes. And this happens incrementally, doesn't happen all at once, and amid growing polarization. And as part of this, right-wing populism has been identified as an important trend. And we're thinking here not just of the radical right challenger parties on the fringes of politics, but also the election of right-wing populist governments in the USA, in Hungary, Poland, India, and Brazil. And according to Mullen, right-wing populist governments are unlikely to overthrow democracy completely, but they do exploit and erode democracy. And he dubs their common strategy the shared populist authoritarian art of governance. And he argues this right-wing populist governance strategy is based on nationalism, hijacking the state for partisan loyalists, weaponizing the economy to secure political power, and using a combination of culture wars, patronage, and clientelism to undermine the media and state institutions like the judiciary. So this is a focus that's looking primarily at the executive and executive aggrandizement. And it's quite an institutional focus, obviously, and looking very much at incremental changes, but often putting these in a sort of wider context of factors like polarization, the growth of inequality, and sort of conflicts over who belongs. So my research question is really growing, or the research is asking fundamentally, Is Boris Johnson's UK Conservative Party presiding over a form of democratic backsliding more usually associated with right-wing populist governments elsewhere? So on the surface, you could say, well, it seems unlikely the Conservatives are a right-wing populist party. They're, known as, for being pragmatic, concerned primarily with achieving and keeping power, and seen, despite, exceptions, of course, Margaret Thatcher, relatively non-ideological when it suits them, big energy payments out now, albeit centre-right party with an affinity for small bets, state and business. And they recently modernised, they've become more socially liberal, introducing equal marriage. And the longevity and stability of the UK political system as a liberal democracy is usually seen as making backsliding unlikely. And for other scholars who are more sceptical about the threat of backsliding to established democracies, they say two other crucial conditions must also coincide if established democracies like the UK are going to become vulnerable: institutional weakness and acute yet unresolvable crises. However, I think there's another side to the argument, obviously, or I wouldn't be here, that the Conservatives have displayed some countervailing tendencies over the last decade, and particularly since the Brexit referendum. They've shifted to the right, obviously, on Europe and immigration, to undermine radical right party like UKIP. And these trends intensified after Johnson's election in July 2019. So more moderate Conservatives like David Galt warned of the dangers of right-wing populism within the Conservative Party. And you've had other sort of examples, the creation of the so-called Common Sense Group, an organisation of MPs and peers claiming to speak for the patriotic, silent majority against the elitist bourgeois liberals who want to rewrite and denigrate the nation's history. And we can also consider whether Brexit and COVID and now the war in Ukraine constitute potentially the acute but resolvable crises that Waylen emphasises. And of course, these trends are contested. There's still strong opposition to these tendencies within the Conservatives, both on the left and the right of the party. But in academic terms, as yet, there seems to be little sustained analysis of these trends. So the Constitution Unit has produced a number of blogs and opinion pieces by Tim Bale, but also Haggard and Kaufman on right-wing populism and the threats to the quality of democracy in the UK, as evidenced by the prorogation of Parliament and the electoral integrity bills. So I'm going to try and do this, and there are two distinct elements to my approach. Firstly, as I've outlined, it uses this recent work on backsliding and right-wing populism to try and put the Conservative Party and recent developments in UK politics within this wider comparative politics framework. And secondly, the research is going to use not just a gendered, but an intersectional lens to explore the Conservative Party's contextual specificities as well as its commonalities with right-wing parties elsewhere. So my starting point is that foregrounding the dynamics of gender, race, class, and sexuality is central to understanding both right-wing populism in general and to highlight the sort of commonalities and the particularities of the UK case. So there are several elements to an intersectional lens in the UK context. So firstly, we can think about gender and sexuality. And one of the things I'm going to do here is a focus on men and masculinities. And hypermasculine leadership is an important element both in right-wing populism and, I would argue, in Johnson's leadership that needs more investigation. And hypermasculine leadership is defined as an exaggerated set of cultural norms and behaviours, usually associated with males, doesn't have to be, as a strategy for creating not just legitimacy, but also a scenario of power itself. And hypermasculine leadership is not monolithic, it's very contextually specific. So if you think about hypermasculine leaders like Trump on the one hand and Putin on the other, they're very different in the form that their leadership takes. And I think we can argue that Johnson exhibits a very particular form of English white elite hypermasculinity. Public school, particularly Oxbridge. Simon Cooper was giving a talk yesterday at LSE about the background of Johnson in Oxbridge, the Bullingdon Club, and associated with particular forms of behaviour, risk-taking, rule-breaking, so-called boosterism, talking everything up, and a very crafted image of the ruffled hair that he apparently ruffles before he goes on camera, various tales of his antics, his infidelity, all those kind of things. So that's one element of a gender and sexuality perspective. On the other hand, thinking about right-wing populism, the sort of anti-gay and anti-reproductive rights sentiments, particularly around abortion, that we normally associate with right-wing popular governments, haven't been salient in the UK to date, but there does seem to be, certainly the trans debates and the policies around trans identities are getting to be one of those issues in the UK. Secondly, race. I think this is central to consider how the legacies of empire, colonialism, slavery shape the contestation around migration and race and English nationalism and xenophobia in the UK that is very important to this Conservative government. And finally, we have to think about class, how these gender and racial dynamics intersect with class. I think is also key to any understanding of the right and right-wing populism in the UK. So Equalities Minister Liz Truss, for example, claimed a couple of years ago that the white working class is the most disadvantaged section of the UK population and a key element of levelling up. So what then is the research actually going to do? How am I going to do it? I'm going to use this approach to examine the period from 2016 Brexit referendum, focusing on 4 key areas: Brexit, COVID, levelling up, and culture wars that I think we can argue are central to the Conservative government and the Conservative Party. And I think each one helps us think about and ascertain how far the Conservative government is using these core elements of Muller's strategy of right-wing populist governance. This, as I said at the beginning, nationalism, hijacking the state, weaponizing the economy, and using culture wars, patronage, and clientelism to undermine the media and state institutions, while practicing executive aggrandizement. And in each of these 4 areas, I'm going to look at 3 core elements: the leadership styles and ideas and rhetoric around the area, the policies that were adopted, and the policy outcomes. And it's a primarily qualitative study using hopefully interview data and other documentary sources. And how much time do I have left? 5 minutes, okay. I'll just say a little bit then about the COVID case study that I've done already, that you can see in more detail. It came out in a special issue of the Journal of European Public Policy on responses to COVID. And I looked at the Johnson government's responses to COVID in terms of these 3 core elements: leadership styles, ideas and rhetoric, the policies adopted, and policy outcomes. And I think if you look at the kind of leadership style that was created or put into practice around the COVID pandemic, it was very much typical of Johnson's leadership style, his hyper-masculine leadership style. There was a lot of nationalism. There was a lot of talk about British exceptionalism. There was a lot of discussion of World War II, of making ventilators like Spitfires. There was a lot of boosterism, that we were going to be world beating in terms of our response. And there was a lot of Johnson's personal risk taking. He famously carried on shaking hands, saying, I will shake hands, you know, with whoever I want to, of course, until he got COVID and was put in intensive care. And then in terms of the policies adopted, that risk taking fed through into the policies, delaying lockdown, living with COVID now, it's, you know, there's no problems, it's over. And in terms of the policy outcomes, apart from the success of the vaccine rollout, there were very well publicised problems. Poor decision making, for example, around care homes. PPE supply has been racked with claims of patronage, of corruption, of cronyism, wastage, poor use of the failure of the test and trace system, poor use of the public sector because of a preference for private sector contractors, leading to very high rates of COVID deaths in the initial stages of the pandemic, high rates of long COVID, and outcomes that were far worse for poor people and people of colour, with gendered effects within the household, where women seem to take on more of the burden of schooling children and domestic work. So in conclusion, I don't have conclusions yet, but any thoughts, comments, suggestions on any aspects of the research would be very welcome. Thank you.
And our final paper on this panel is by Martin Farr.
Okay. Yes, on foreign policy. Wasn't to know this at the time, but we meet at the end of a week of two new lows in the British government, by which I mean the report on the withdrawal from Afghanistan on Monday, and then 2 days later, the Grey report. I'll return to the Afghanistan report later, dismissing in action nuclear leadership and the withdrawal from Afghanistan from the Foreign Affairs Committee. That will be my concluding remarks. So it's been another dismal week. And one of the many curious things about this Johnson era is that when, I don't know, other people in the room, I'd be interested to know their thoughts on this, when one is asked for comment about current affairs or government or what's been happening about the Prime Minister, in the past, I've never found it very difficult to distance my personal views from an analytical position. But with this Prime Minister, even an analytical position sounds like one is imposing one's own views, because, I mean, it was also, I mean, we've got so used to it, it's the boiling the frog thing. It happens very slowly. I've never known a Prime Minister to be accused of lying so repeatedly, so publicly in the Chamber of House of Commons. It's become now a matter of course, and it never happened before. And when one discusses him, and his administration, one almost feels that one is using personal opinions and condemnation and partisan lines, when all one is doing is really being analytical. There hasn't been, as far as I mean, in my knowledge of British politics since the First World War, Lloyd George is as dishonest a Prime Minister as Johnson. Never has there been, apart from Lloyd George, such a continually blatantly dishonest politician, as we've heard from Georgina just now. And yet it hasn't mattered. And also for foreign policy, there's never been a Prime Minister who's come to power on such a foreign policy related matter. Now, Brexit, of course, is multifaceted, it's domestic as well as foreign policy. But apart from wartime, so Lloyd George, Churchill, arguably Macmillan in '57, there hasn't been a Prime Minister who's come to office on the basis of an external policy since Jim Hacker and the Euro sausage. This is a comparable level of populism leading into a Prime Minister in office. And that's part of one of the things that Congress today, I'm sure, is that Johnsonism wasn't conceived prior to office. It has been extemporized in office. There was no preparation. But insofar as there was the project framed by Brexit and framed by the appeal of Brexit. in all of its multifaceted dimensions. And as far as Britain's reputation internationally is concerned, the Prime Minister's association with Brexit is absolutely central. Again, this is where I sound like I'm giving a personal opinion, but I'm trying to be analytical. The damage done to Britain's reputation internationally through Brexit, through the conduct of the withdrawal from the European Union, not so much the decision to leave, but the actual conduct of the withdrawal, was so incompetent, was so disingenuous. And this is something which has a large footprint, as I'll mention later on with the protocol for Northern Ireland. And also, again, I'm always drawn back to Lloyd George much more than Churchill. The Prime Minister being opportunistic. Now, this, of course, is an essential requirement of any politician to respond to circumstances, to be to an extent reactive, but also to give some sense of purpose. But Johnson's opportunism is very, very evident in foreign policy terms. Usually there are protocols where opportunism falters, but in foreign policy, an event may take place which kind of allows the person to rise to circumstances. And I would suggest Ukraine is doing that, and I'll return to Ukraine a bit later. There's also no reason to think that foreign policy of this government should be undertaken any more purposefully or competently than any other aspect of this government's behaviour. Again, I sound like I'm giving a personal opinion here. I can't recall, because the government purged itself of so much talent because of Brexit before Johnson came to power, or before the election. I can't think of a government that's been so denuded of weight and bottom as this government. And that's one reason why we've had two quite undistinguished foreign secretaries. I think the replacement of Jeremy Hunt with Dominic Raab is very significant for what this says about Johnson as a Prime Minister and this as a government. But what we have in one of the interesting dimensions to this is that we have unusually a blueprint for foreign policy insofar as there is global Britain, this notion of global Britain, which of course predated Johnson. Theresa May discussed it, she mentioned it 7 times in her speech to conference in October 2016. Johnson adopts this and, using Georgina's word, gives it boosters and presents it with much greater brio. And of course, global Britain is, if one were being unkind, is putting lipstick on the pig. It's trying to make something of Britain post-Brexit and saying that Britain has not become an insular country. It is, as it always has been, and in the past, certainly, again, this is the point Georgina mentioned, in this notion of Britain's glorious past, in a very distinguished sense, has always been global. But there's meat on the bones insofar as we have the integration review, which was scheduled to have been published in 2020, came out last year, which is a very significant document. And it brings together for the first time, really, although again, most of these things are trends. There was a trend for trying to integrate defence and strategy and intelligence before this. But this is a uniquely integrated policy document of security, defence, foreign policy, and development, and also trade, although trade isn't mentioned explicitly as much as it might be. A big part of Britain, of course, post-Brexit is trade, and has 4 main aspects, I'm sure you know. The international rules-based system, the international security of that system, and in the document it makes much of China and indeed Russia as being the most present threat. The Chinese dimension is mentioned as a tilt. The Americans are pivoting, they're tilting towards the Pacific. Remarkable how this has changed in the course of 18 months. The third is global resilience, so cyber, development issues, climate, health. Again, this is written and published in the middle of the pandemic, so Gavi and World Health Organization. And the fourth is economic integration, so trade with the previous 3 elements, such as Britain joining the CPTPP, and this maps very closely into the domestic Brexit agenda. So can foreign, this is a unique dimension to Johnson, I think, which is the connection of foreign affairs with the domestic, trying to suggest ways in which foreign policy can relate to use the term that he uses, levelling up, to demonstrate how this relates to people's ordinary lives. The big question that wasn't really addressed, and it's very curious its absence, was the EU, where the EU sits in the integration review. So 18 months later, what can we say about this beyond the rhetoric of the document itself? I think one could say that as far as the international rules-based system is concerned, Britain has lived up to the rhetoric. It has been, again, one of the things about Johnson, this also applied to Thatcher, is how lucky he is in things aligning, circumstances aligning, concatenating in ways which are quite advantageous. So he comes to office and Britain happens to be leading the G7, happens to have COP26. happens to be at the centre of these global networks, which allows the Global Britain Integrated Review to have a sense of purpose. And the G7, and also it's kind of, it was actually a D10, we call it the Democratic 10, inviting South Korea, Australia, and so on to Cornwall, demonstrating this in the age of the rise of a more assertive China and Russia. In the second category, international security of the rules-based system, one could argue, yes, Britain has also fulfilled its promise. There's been £4 billion net increase in defence spending, for example. There's been a joint expeditionary force, which I'll return to in a moment, for example. There's been AUKUS with Australians and Americans. There's been Ukraine, there's been a carrier strike route to the Pacific, the meaning of which we can debate, but these are nevertheless demonstrations of this being something which matters to the country. The third area, global resilience, one could say this has been less fulfilled. COP26 notwithstanding, and COVAX notwithstanding, and Britain's role in the pandemic as an international actor, I think, was quite significant. But the cut in development spending, 35% cut in development spending, the merging of development into the Foreign Office, I think could be regarded as not living up to the notion of supporting global resilience as a policy area. Cuts in global health, cuts in spending in Africa, and so on. And the fourth category, economic integration. This is very much an ish area because there have been many free trade deals, but lots of them have been cut and pasted from what we were doing before. That I think is very much an open-ended area. And again, at the end of it, we are asking ourselves, what is the case of Britain and the EU? So what these, I think, point to is Britain as a framework country, as a convening country, as a brokering power. The government uses the term shaping power. And I want to just deal with two areas of foreign policy, one of which is not the EU, the other which is the EU, and what Johnsonism seems to mean. The not EU foreign policy area is the British view has, and this again, this predates Johnson, it's been about European security through NATO rather than through the EU. And since we've left, of course, this has allowed Macron, which is the French view of having a much greater sense of European Union direction and autonomy in foreign policy terms. And what Britain has been keen to lead is this rather awful new word, plurilateralism. So ad hoc associations of small groups of countries, which for Britain historically, and also since Brexit, I think these have been North European, Eastern and Central European and Nordic countries, security arrangements with Poland and Greece, for example. Many of these were pre-Brexit, the pre-Brexit pro-British countries. The JEF, Joint Expeditionary Force, is significant here, and this predated Ukraine, but it will have, I think, even more legs after it, which is NATO-aligned countries. Many of them are in the EU, but some aren't, such as the UK, Norway, and Iceland. And the other countries are Denmark, Netherlands, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And Sweden and Finland are part of this. And Sweden and Finland, of course, are now part of fast track into NATO. Britain, again, it's opportunistic, but it makes sense, predated their application by a few days in announcing a solemn declaration to defend Finland and Sweden in the event of attack. So Article 5 before they join NATO. And there's also the courting of right-wing governments in Budapest and Warsaw. The association, I mean, Budapest is particularly toxic, but the Johnson and the Prime Ministers of Poland and Hungary has been something which is not to everyone's taste. In terms of the European Union foreign policy, all of this good work, one could say, all of this working and building bridges and mending fences and so on, is potentially undone by the protocol. The protocol, I'm trying to think of any, I'm interested in your thoughts on this, whether there's a more emblematic Johnson policy than the protocol in mind, in terms of what it means, in terms of its simultaneous deception of various parties. And this has potentially huge damage for the European Union. Britain risked being frozen out of trials in 2020. Britain refused a post-Brexit security and foreign policy arrangement. The Joint Expeditionary Force arguably is the European army that the EU never managed. And we have the continual issue about Britain competing with France and Germany for influence. This is more important, arguably, since Brexit. I mean, before Brexit, Britain was very keen, and this is the Thatcher view about broadening rather than deepening, was quite keen to back applicants for EU membership to offset the power of Paris and Berlin. And it's interesting how post-Brexit, the French are still, or Macron certainly is sceptical about Ukraine's EU membership. France has provided much less support to Ukraine than Britain has, much less than Estonia has. And relations with France are particularly bad. And so we have Macron re-elected with a reduced, but with a mandate nevertheless, and relations with Britain are as bad as they've ever been. So I suppose what I'm getting at in a way is that, and this is not an original thought, is that the integration review was discussing the ways in which Britain is part of a wider pivot to the Pacific and to China. And we've been wrenched back, and there's a long history of this, of course, a long history of defence reviews. I mean, you know, infamously the Knot Review, getting rid of half of the Navy before the Falklands were invaded. And this frantic backpedaling to reverse a defence review, because these are very hard things to predict. They're very expensive, they're very slow. But the integration review, the one thing that has, I think, been demonstrated already to have been, not misjudged necessarily, but to have been in need of revision, is this notion that Europe still matters, that we've been brought back to Europe as a theatre, as a foreign policy area. And that's where I think Johnsonism and foreign policy, if one can say that, because foreign policy is to a large extent, even more than most policy areas, reactive to external circumstances and factors. There is a sense here in which we're seeking to divide and to deal with bits of Europe rather than the European Union. And the protocol is, of course, a political choice. It is both opportunistic, it is, as I mentioned, duplicitous, it is also a reflection of domestic attitudes, a bit like the Rwandan policy for migrants. It is, I mean, like it or not, these things do have salience with the electorate. A penultimate sort of bit on Ukraine. And I was earlier this month at the Defence of Europe conference at King's London, where the then was the Defence Secretary spoke and the Ukrainian ambassador, and it's a very big kind of international event. And it was very interesting. It reinforced many things that and gave weight to things that I felt before. Essentially, my sense was it was doubling down. It allowed Britain to double down, to use one of these terms that we got used to during the Brexit wars, of re-entrenching attitudes and values. It reinforced the importance of the Transatlantic Alliance. It reinforced the importance of liberal democracy. It reinforced the hostility to Russia, which had been growing. Of course, Johnson was Foreign Secretary during the Salisbury poisoning. I mean, this is a state which has conducted assassinations on British territory. It reinforced the notion of global Britain. One did feel, and this is what the Polish Foreign Minister was there and so on, and saying how Britain was leading. The Polish Foreign Minister said, "Thank you, Britain," and so on and so on. There was a certain, admittedly, it was for a certain audience, but one did get a sense this did provide an opportunity, a platform for Britain post-Brexit, for this plurilateralism. But again, the question at the back of the mind was always about what about the EU? What are we doing with the EU? And what will the protocol mean as far as that's concerned? So Ukraine has meant that the UK has been galvanized, I would suggest. It demonstrated quite strikingly how our intelligence was right. GCHQ, the American National Security Agency, were right about this. Striking how much, I mean, I was going back the other day, just going through articles in January. It won't happen, this is all being invented by the West and so on, and of course it happened. So it reinforces the importance of intelligence, the veracity of intelligence, which of course took an enormous hit after Iran. And the cooperation between them. Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, said in the press conference of this trust about how our teams are in constant contact about this. So that was an important element because, of course, I've mentioned Trump. I've written at length about Trump and Johnson, which I'm happy to talk about afterwards. Because, of course, the funny thing about Trump and Johnson is I thought I put it to bed. And you may find ourselves with Trump and Johnson again in 2 years' time. And the ways in which they have similarities of outlook and behaviour and so on, as we've just heard. But Britain did, and so Britain was concerned about losing, at the same time as Brexit, losing its anchor in terms of a multilateral, institutions-based, treaty-based American administration. We have that now. There were concerns about Ireland for the Biden administration, but leaving the protocol aside for a moment, the cooperation has been very, very close and it's worked very well. Britain led about SWIFT, Britain led about trying to remove, essentially disconnect the G20 economy from the global economy. It was leading in terms of lethal aid, and you've seen the YouTube videos, God Save the Queen, as another Russian tank blows up. Less effective on refugees, as we know. And of course, this is part of a broader stretch which predates Johnson. The MOD has been supporting Ukraine since 2015, since Crimea, Operation Orbital, Johnson has been associated with this very personally, though. So unlike Macron or Schulz, he's been in Kyiv. He's been seen in person with Zelensky. This is, and it's a very using private eye cover a couple of weeks ago. So thank you for saving me. They both saved each other as they're meeting Kyiv. But nevertheless, also failure to foreign policy. The fact is, Putin was not deterred from invading. That London is awash with Russian cash, the kleptocracy, and so on. So it's mixed patterns. These things invariably are. But also, Ukraine has galvanised the EU, and one of our main ambitions has always been to be the principal NATO power, the principal US power in Europe, and now, of course, Germany, through increasing defence spending with the leading power. So there are domestic implications here about the requirement in defence spending, which will mean Britain still retains that position, which I think will have to happen for any government, really, would like it or not. And also the UK preference for G7 as a means of waging this war economically rather than the EU. And as a last point on Ukraine, the risks. Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, wants all Ukrainian territory from 2014 returned to Ukraine, which constitutes an enormous escalation, which Johnson has said, quote, is entirely logical. I mean, there are very grave implications here. Very last comment then, as I wind up, is to return to the report Missing in Action, the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee report on withdrawal from Afghanistan, published on Monday, which describes a Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, quote, as chaotic and arbitrary. I read the report on Monday, before the report on Wednesday, shaking my head. I'm thinking about Peter Carrington, who resigned over the Falklands when it wasn't anything responsible for his, actually. And to read, a bit like the Grey Report, to read this catalogue of malfeasance with no consequences on careers, it's really extraordinary. Chaotic and arbitrary, quote, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, quote, was a disaster and a betrayal of our allies that will damage the UK's interests for years to come. A fundamental lack of seriousness, grip, or leadership at a time of national emergency. It went on, it pointed out, quote, limited US consultation points to a worrying lack of British influence in Washington. The basic point of the report was that we knew for 18 months the Americans were going to cut and run and didn't prepare. I mean, it's the most extraordinary document, which was rather forgotten in the melee of Partygate. And to take a very small example, that perhaps the most, I mean, it's a very minor but extremely egregious example, is Nowzad, a 260-seat airliner chartered, full, with one human being on board, and full of dogs and cats. And the report says, quote, senior SCDO officials believe the decision came directly from the Prime Minister, which of course he denied. So, arbitrary, opportunistic, undisciplined, impulsive, consequential. This is a thread we may tug on for the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have gone over the scheduled time, but we lost 15 minutes at the beginning. So what I intend is to take 6 minutes of very brief, well-rounded questions, which are no longer than one sentence. And we'll prioritize people on Zoom. If anyone in person has any questions, they can perhaps ask them as we have coffee. Do you want to take them from Zoom, David? And if anyone in the room, if anybody in person does have any, put your hand up and we'll take them very quickly.
Oh, Daniel Desmond.
Can you put them on the screen?
Should I go?
Oh,
Can you hear me?
Anyway,
Okay, should I just go? I don't know if people in the room can hear me.
Yes, we can.
You can? Okay, sorry, apologies for that confusion. So my question was for Georgina, and it was building a little bit on the last presentation, just to ask whether the changes to the 0.7 and the merger of the FCDO, well, the merger to create the FCDO, so the changes on aid policy are going to form part of that consideration of race as part of her intersectional framework, so whether international development is going to feature in that project. Thank you.
Straight away.
The short answer is I hadn't thought about it, but I think while I was thinking about this presentation, that in some ways the 4 categories or the 4 themes are quite narrow, and so I think I will have to add something in for kind of wider government policies. So yeah, I think that is an important one. So thank you for that.
Any further questions from Zoom? Any in the room?
Actually, just to follow on from that, one of the other things I was thinking about was there's some literature on toxic masculinity and environmental policy. And so that might be something to look at as well in terms of expanding those things. Because obviously the hypermasculinity becomes toxic masculinity, partly just as something to associate with environmental change. But it's not very flat there.
Any other questions from the virtual audience? Can't see any. If you're trying to put your hand up and for whatever reason can't, just turn on your microphone and ask the question. If not, we'll start our break, which will take for 20 minutes.
Till 1:30.
If there are no further questions, we'll return at 1:30. And if anyone in person has any questions for the panelists, they will be around. Thank you very much.